those that don't know me, my name is Sean. I work for Risk Labs, which is the foundation that is tasked with building the UMA protocol ecosystem. And I work on what's known as the developer experience team, which is kind of a broad term, not super descriptive, but basically I work on operations things, making sure things don't break and things run smoothly. And I also work on partner integrations. So I've worked with quite a few SuperUMANs on various KPI option opportunities, as well as some optimistic Oracle integrations. Basically, the agenda is this. What I want to talk about is UMA's optimistic Oracle, which is really, UMA's core product and the thing that I want everybody to be evangelizing, like all of the UMA fans out there, as well as SuperUMANs. Like, this is really the thing that I care the most about on UMA, and I just think it's like damn cool. So first of all, I'm just here to talk about the optimistic Oracle, what it is and why it's important. And then also, real quickly, just like how do the mechanics of the optimistic Oracle work? It's essentially like an escalation game, and how does that escalation game play out? And then more of the meat of the presentation will be who uses the optimistic Oracle today? What are some like ongoing integrations that are like currently receiving data from the optimistic Oracle? And related to that, how can the community start being involved in actually securing the optimistic Oracle and participating in the ecosystem and even potentially earning some like extra financial incentive by participating? So I'm calling that, in quotes, proposer opportunity program, where people could actively participate in the optimistic Oracle system today. So we'll walk through what that looks like. Related to that, some tooling that will be available to people that want to do that, as well as going through a new interface that we're actually just releasing today that will basically help people interact with the optimistic Oracle, as well as just monitor it to see what's going on in kind of the UMA Oracle system. And if by some miracle I get through all of that relatively quickly, I'm going to do my best to leave 10 to 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. So real quickly, I think most people know what the UMA optimistic Oracle is, but essentially what it is it's a method, and like all DeFi oracles, it's a method to quickly and securely bring any sort of off-chain information on-chain. UMA's optimistic Oracle, we believe, is unique from other things like Chainlink, for example, because it can be asked very generalized types of questions. And that's the first point. So not only can it provide pieces of information like what was the price of Ethereum at this one specific point in time, but somebody could also ask it a plain text question. Like I could ask it, who won like the Buffalo Bills Kansas City Chiefs game last week? And we have this escalation game. So the optimistic Oracle is essentially an escalation game where a requester can come in and ask that question. And then anybody in the system can be incentivized to come in and propose the answer to that. So the optimistic Oracle essentially just gives different unknown parties within the system a way to securely interact with each other and end up with this result of secure information on chain. It's known as an optimistic Oracle because it's kind of similar in concept to something like an optimistic rollup, where basically there is a liveness time or like a challenge period where participants can come in and challenge the validity of certain pieces of information. And then if that does not happen, it's kind of optimistically assuming that that information is correct. So if somebody doesn't come in and challenge that a piece of information is incorrect, then the kind of system then takes that answer as canon. Then the final piece of kind of what it is the DVM. This is something I think everybody should be familiar with, but basically the DVM is a final piece in the escalation game where any UMA voter can help resolve disputes that basically arose within the optimistic Oracle. So optimistic Oracle is an escalation game before the DVM, but then the DVM is the thing that ultimately secures this. And so all UMA token holders participating in resolving price requests is ultimately what secures our optimistic oracle. And then today, I think we just announced this maybe late yesterday, but the optimistic oracle is now available on Arbitrum, Optimism, Boba, Polygon, and of course, Ethereum mainnet. So I think I just covered a lot of this, but this is a diagram from our documentation. So the way that the optimistic oracle actually works is like relatively simple. We don't really need to read every single piece of information on this diagram. I personally think the most important is just these participants over here. So this requester, proposer, and disputer. Like I just said, basically anybody can come in and say like, hey, I want to know the answer to this question that I want to ask. So I can go in and I can ask that. And then anybody else in the network can act as a proposer. And a proposer, or I myself could also act as the proposer. A proposer can basically look at my question on the optimistic oracle, and that proposer can then basically post a bonded answer. Usually associated with the request is some sort of financial reward where a requester can basically pay this unknown party, basically say, I will pay X amount of money to the first person that correctly responds to my price request. And then these proposers can come along and say, hey, like I can determine the answer to that question and I feel very confident about it. So confident, in fact, that I can post a larger bond. So I can post a larger amount of money to basically assure that I'm kind of trying to respond honestly. So the proposer responds with an answer to the price requester's question and bonds that answer. And then that proposal goes into this dispute period. So this is like a challenge window where the third party can come into play. So this happens very, very rarely, but as the amount of requests increases in the optimistic oracle, we expect to see more of this. But because anybody can propose an answer to the original question, there needs to be some sort of verification of that answer, right? Otherwise, anybody could just propose any answer they wanted. And I mean, that's not a great oracle system. So the disputer basically comes along and independently calculates their own answer. And if they disagree with the proposer, they can also post a bond and submit a transaction that says, hey, I disagree with this answer. That is what ultimately sends this escalation game to the DVM. Now, the disputer would do that because basically, if they do correctly dispute a proposal, then they can win a portion of the proposer's bond. So basically, disputers are financially incentivized to pay attention as well. I would highly recommend going in, like reviewing this diagram again, because there's a lot of components to this. But I think just thinking about it from perspective of who the personas are in the system kind of makes it, relatively intuitive. So here is basically just a summary of what we just talked about. The process is always there's a request for information, there's a proposal in response to that request, there's then a challenge or liveness period where that proposal can be reviewed. And then optionally and rarely, there can be a dispute filed on that proposal. Also, the requester will pay a reward and also set what the bond amount, so set basically what the insurance amount that this proposer and disputer needs to pay to respond to their request, and also will set this challenge period length. So I don't think we have enough time to talk about this fully today because it's kind of I can definitely give you guys the slides. I will make these available after this call. But I don't think we have enough time to talk about this fully today, but it's actually super interesting, like how people should correctly set like liveness periods and bonds. But basically, I think kind of the generic rule is that the larger the bond size, the more amount of money it takes for somebody to put in escrow to say that they're correctly responding. And the longer the liveness period, so basically the longer amount of time that people have to come in and verify proposals, that makes for more secure price request. So it gives the price requester more assurance that their data that they're receiving back is correct. And then the proposer within the system, kind of the financial incentives at play are they are staking a bond plus a final fee. It's probably unnecessarily confusing, and we can just think of the entire thing as a bond. Basically, a set amount of money to like an escrow to the optimistic oracle, which acts as an escrow contract to hold the money. And they do this, they propose because they're trying to earn the reward that the requester paid. Now, if they are correct, they of course get their bond and final fee and the reward all back. So they make money on this. If they're incorrect, so if a disputer comes along and also posts a bond and says, hey, this proposer is incorrect, and then it escalates to the DVM, and the DVM says that the disputer was correct and the proposer was incorrect, then the proposer will lose this bond and, of course, not earn the reward. And the disputer will earn a portion of the proposer's bond as well as the reward. I'm going to stop there real quick and take maybe, if anybody has any questions, I'll just open it up now to maybe one or two.
I got a couple. What happens if an error in information appears after the liveness period closes?
That's like something that cannot typically be prevented with the optimistic oracle. I would say like all oracle systems suffer from that. So if a price is, say, I think the most simple example would be, say, like we're trying to determine what the price of ETH is at a specific timestamp, like 5 minutes ago. Sometimes exchanges will report information incorrectly, and you could foresee an event where somebody could report the price of ETH, but then like that pricing information is updated, and in the best case scenario, the liveness time is long enough where disputers could see that that pricing information was updated and dispute the original proposal. But if, it doesn't happen until after the liveness period is over, that's like not something that can really be prevented except for kind of within the price request parameterization. So like setting longer liveness times or having more hardened pricing implementations that are present within the price request, that helps to prevent those scenarios. And also, if you compare it to a system like instantaneous on-chain price feeds, like, other Oracle systems, this at least gives you some amount of liveness time to review that. So I would argue that it's ultimately much, much more secure to kind of erroneous data availability and stuff like that.
If you have a tit for tat game, and let's just assume the sinister players got infinite resources just to make the game easier. Is that a winnable game, or is there something to prevent simply outbidding everyone else to the point where you can pay for truth?
So outbidding people in kind of what context?
Presumably I can outbid everyone and my dispute becomes true because other people are unwilling to post a bond to kind of prevent that, or am I misunderstanding the way that the Oracle system is constructed?
I think you're like pretty close. So the one difference would be like, it's not about who posts the larger bond in the dispute step. Like that is not the price that's accepted. The disputer does not actually return any sort of price. The disputer is simply flagging the fact that they disagree with their initial proposal. What happens when the disputer posts their bond and disputes it is that it goes to this larger voting system. So one thing we could get into, but would be like a very long discussion, is like UMA has this concept of basically balancing the value that it secures with price requests against the value of UMA's market cap or UMA's voting market cap. So like basically a malicious disputer, sure, they could post a bond and dispute it, and they could dispute it incorrectly. But at that time, it's economically secured by the value that's in UMA's market cap, because UMA voters are now voting on what the correct price would be with individual UMA tokens. So if you wanted to control more than like 51% of the voting power at that time, then you would need to purchase like a large amount of UMA tokens. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I think you're saying that they have to acquire the 51% in terms of UMA in order to successfully win a escalation game. and assuming that that value of the bond actually is less than the 51% of the market cap they would acquire. I think that's what you described, but I'm not sure why that would prevent me from doing that, because I get my UMA and I get to win the vote, so that ultimately I get the reward and then I can sell off my UMA if I wanted to. I might be totally screwing this up.
It's not about balancing like the bond size against like the cost of purchasing all of that UMA. It's about balancing the bond size plus the value that they could steal by manipulating that price request against the cost of obtaining all of that UMA. Great questions though. I do think in the interest of time, because I do have a few more slides, I'm going to move forward. So what does the optimistic oracle actually do? Who actually uses this crazy thing today? There's like a ton of use cases now, right? One that, a lot of SuperUMAN should be super familiar with is KPI options. So any sort of contract that's launched using UMA's LSP contract template, including KPI options, uses the optimistic oracle system to arrive at its settlement price. I think that's a really powerful use case where you can see what the optimistic oracle is capable of. We can calculate these very complex or like bespoke things and ask the optimistic oracle for it and put a day or multi-day challenge period on this thing and allow people to securely arrive at settlement values for crazy things like KPI options. Also, there's like cool financial products like YAM Synths, has created indices that track, say, median gas prices over a month or median CryptoPunk prices. There's also protocols like Sherlock, which is a decentralized insurance protocol, which could conceivably request the optimistic oracle for kind of a dispute resolution on like an insurance payout between the insurer and the insured protocols. And then the one that we'll talk about the most today is some prediction markets, including specifically Polymarket, now use the optimistic oracle to arrive at settlement values for information markets. So like betting on binary outcomes for information markets is like a great use case of the optimistic oracle. So we're on to the Proposer Opportunity Program, and it's directly related to kind of a recent escalation of like a specific type of optimistic oracle usage. So recently, the UMA optimistic oracle was integrated with Polymarket, and like I said, Polymarket is a prediction markets platform. They basically needed a way to resolve these markets in a decentralized and secure manner. So they're now using the optimistic oracle to do this. We can see an example market over here where the question is like, will MetaMask airdrop a native token by March 31st, 2022? And we can see that the resolver here listed is UMA. So what Polymarket does is they use what's known in the UMA system. There are these things called price identifiers, which essentially lay out the methodology that people should use to arrive at the value that they should propose. So Polymarket simply asks very simple yes or no questions where they'll ask questions like, did the Lakers win the Lakers versus Clippers game last night by more than 3 points? And they'll ask this by encoding that plain text question within the price request transaction. Basically, anybody could come along and respond to that question and say, yes, the Lakers did win by more than 3 points last night, or no, they did not. And there's a couple of other options that we'll get into. And if I wanted to do that, I could go in, and currently Polymarket sets all of their bonds at 2,500 USDC. There's also a $1,500 USDC final fee, but I could go in and I could post and put basically into escrow this $4,000 bond. And if I was correct and nobody disputed my answer of the Lakers winning by more than 3 points, then I would basically earn Polymarket's 50 USDC reward. Might seem like maybe not a great deal, but right now there's approximately like 40 to 50 requests going through. So there is a decent amount of money available to like willing proposers in the system. So I think it's a pretty cool opportunity. So when I say proposer opportunity program, kind of implies that there's some sort of artificial incentive being injected here, but there's really not. This is just entirely the way that the optimistic oracle is intended to be used in terms of financial incentives. So I think the biggest question I would foresee people having if they were interested in participating in the optimistic oracle and helping to secure it, the biggest question would be, how do I get started? Basically, before this Polymarket opportunity, there definitely was not the same volume of requests that require a massive human element. All of these prediction market requests are all basically asking questions that need to be answered by humans. They need human eyes on them. They probably will require like larger reward sizes. This is in contrast to like usage of the optimistic oracle before, where a lot of this price proposal and price verification could be handled by more automated bot infrastructure. And those were really the participants. These requests specifically cannot be answered or checked by bot infrastructure, so kind of requires human eyes on them. And to give the whole UMA community and the SuperUMANs more visibility into what's going on the optimistic oracle side, there's a couple of things. So the first will be within the UMA Discord, there will be a channel where anytime a price request or a price proposal or a price dispute is filed on the optimistic oracle, that will be logged within this channel. So basically, like all of those high level things we were just talking about, like somebody submitting a request, that is shown within this Discord channel. So somebody asked, who won this Chiefs versus Bengals playoffs game? That would be logged here kind of instantaneously. And I could like use this to get more information about the current request that's happening on the optimistic oracle. So I just wanted to basically show you guys that the channel actually exists. It just needs to be made public. But basically, anytime an event happens on the optimistic oracle, it's shown there almost instantaneously. And from there will also be a link in a separate message that's logged that says view this request in the UI. So I have like one of the UI screens up already. So I could click the link from a price request and be brought to a screen that looks like this. And all this DApp does is it gives me an easy way to either propose a response, so to stake my bond and try to earn the proposal reward. Here it's only 10 USDC. I could type my answer in here and just click this button. I don't have any USDC in this wallet, but just click this button and respond with whatever I think the answer is. Down here, like more importantly, I need to know what I'm actually trying to respond to. And here I can see what the actual question was. So I can see that the question is framed in the future tense, but I can kind of discern what it means. Like, will the Rams beat the 49ers by more than 3.5 points in their January 30th matchup? It is Feb 1 now. So I know that that game's already happened. And if I did want to answer this, simply all I would have to do is either have, watched the game, or I could just do a simple Google search and see who won that game. Further on in the question, it kind of gives me instructions of what values I should return in certain situations. So it says if the Los Angeles Rams win by over 3.5 points, the market will resolve to yes. And then, if the 49ers lose by less than 3.5 points or they win, the market resolves to no. So later on in the question, it's kind of confusing terminology, but the more that you look at these things, the more you get used to them. It says P2 corresponds to a yes. So if I did think the Rams won by over 3.5 points, then I would be answering yes. And P2 is a value of 1. So kind of in the traditional binary answer format, I'd be using 1 to designate a yes answer. Sometimes these questions will say things like, they'll still be binary questions, right? So the question would be something like, who won this game on January 30th? Was it the Rams or the 49ers, instead of like a straight yes or no question? But in those situations, within the ancillary data, it should always be noted what value corresponds to which answer. So you should always be able to kind of arrive at your own conclusions simply by reading the question that's listed here under ancillary data. So I don't have any USDC here right now, but like in this case, does anybody actually know if they won by over 3.5? I know the Rams won. I think they only won by 3, right? We'll pretend they only won by 3. So in this situation, I would answer no, and I would type in 0 here, and then I would propose. And this would draw 3,000 USDC from my wallet, and this question state would move into a proposed state. And anybody could also use this same UI to dispute that proposal. But if nobody disputed it, then I would get my reward at the end of that challenge period. So for most, it's after 2 hours, I would get that reward plus my 3,000 USDC back. But if somebody did dispute it, then we go into that longer DVM escalation game like we were talking about. I know this is a ton of information to consume, so the other things will be, I will post these slides after we're done here. And with those, there's also documentation that will explain exactly kind of how the yes or no query works, which is these types of price requests. And also just a click-by-click walkthrough on how this optimistic Oracle interface works and like how you could use it. And then the last slide, this is something that, we'll just gloss over real quick, but will be more present in the documentation for these types of requests, like the one we just looked at. There's basically like 4 possible answers usually. I know I called them binary questions, so I apologize for being a little misleading, but like we talked about, usually, I should always read the question, but usually, yes answers correspond to a value of 1, and that's what I should return. A no answer corresponds to a value of 0, and that's what I should return. Sometimes people will ask questions that are kind of nonsense questions, or I can't like confidently respond to. And in those situations, I should respond with the value of 0.5. I think an example of this the other day was, there was a question asked about a UFC fight and like a martial arts kind of event fight, and it had actually been canceled. So it was asking who won that fight, and like the answer definitively could not be determined. So the correct answer to respond would be 0.5. One other situation, and this will be explained much, much more. So this probably seems very confusing, but like one other situation that could arise would be, if a yes or no question is asked about like an event that hasn't happened yet. So if I asked about like who won the Super Bowl this year, in those situations, it's kind of explained more in the UMIP, but in those situations, you're kind of responding that this question was asked too early and it should basically be requested later on. We can't actually answer it this time. So I feel like I ended with probably the most in-depth slide. So basically, like as a summary, hopefully I gave you guys like a decent overview of how the optimistic Oracle works and kind of who their requesters and proposers and disputers are. Also, like personally, I'm pretty proud of where like the optimistic Oracle is today. And I think it's like very, very useful. And like, I really want to grow kind of this page. Like I didn't put 99% of the partners that we have on here, but I just want to continue to grow it because I do believe the optimistic Oracle is super useful. And the way that it is useful is kind of the participants in the UMA ecosystem are financially incentivized to participate and to kind of turn this Oracle into an Oracle that's secured by like the people that run it. Yeah. And I think I'll stop there. I think I promised 10 to 15 minutes for questions. So
cool. That's perfect. Do we have any questions?
Hey, just want to say, really loved the presentation. It was a great kind of overview recap for those of us who are aware of the optimistic Oracle and how it works. Wraith is over here, by the way.
Hey, Wraith.
I think just a question on the end, or probably a 2-part question. One is, it seemed to me like it's a first come, first serve situation for the proposer, where the first proposer that posts the bond with the answer that is not disputed is the one that would get the reward. Is that accurate?
That is correct. Yes, that's accurate. So it's a first come, first serve. But like you said, you're not actually able to propose if somebody else has proposed in front of you. So that's kind of the proposal that's taken as like canon for that specific request. And what you could do is, like, if somebody else proposed in front of you and you disagreed with their proposal and kind of you were very, very confident that this person got it wrong, then you could also dispute that proposal. So you could still, in some cases, participate, but it is a first come, first serve proposal process. Hopefully, like, questions like this are incredibly hard to kind of game or optimize for. So you can't watch like the mempool and try to like front. Yeah, you can't front run everybody else's kind of transactions, right? Because it does require kind of a human being there and paying attention and saying, you know, I Googled this, like I came to these conclusions on my own and input the answer.
Got it. Yeah, that sounds great. Sounds like we need to have a sub team within the products team, maybe, that mans the OO request that come in on the new channel. Yeah, I mentioned two parts. So the second part is, and I'm pretty sure I know. I just want to like confirm, if you answer incorrectly with your bond, you don't receive the bond back. Or did I make a mistake there?
No, that's exactly correct. So yeah, like all of these kind of questions should be like, there's varying levels of complexity for requests to the optimistic oracle, right? Kind of the ones that we are covering today are typically like things that could be Googled, right? Like the outcomes to sports games or the outcomes to political elections, stuff like that. So like you should be able to, in most cases, like definitively arrive at an answer and be confident in that answer. But like that answer, you should always be confident in that answer before proposing, because yes, like when you post a bond, if you do get it incorrect, you lose that. And that's there because otherwise I could just maliciously come along and say, take the wrong side of these financial markets for like super, super cheap amounts, and then come along and try to just propose a bunch of things and try to sneak one through. And if I'm not financially penalized for, you know, responding incorrectly and having somebody catch me doing that, then I just have kind of complete incentive to act maliciously.
Perfect. I think that's pretty much what I was expecting, but just wanted to be 100% sure. Because that means that from our side, if we were to have like a couple of folks that were running this like as an actual sort of service from our side, we would want to be doing it with folks that would be able to ensure the answers are accurate, because they will be more than likely, you know, possibly again, and so of course we'd have to go through our governance and so on, but using, you know, our treasury funds to actually fund the bonds. So it would have to be that, you know, we'd want to ensure these are done correctly by a group of folks that can be, you know, trusted with that. Yeah, just wanted to basically make sure then what are the considerations from our side to actually run this as maybe as a DAO. If individuals also want to do it, then great. But of course, it would be interesting to see if we could do it more as the SuperUMANs. But that's of course a larger separate discussion. Thanks again.
That's not something I had thought of, but thinking of this as like a SuperUMAN like DAO revenue generation tool, I think would be really cool. And I don't know, I think that's just like a super great thought, Rathers, and not something I had kind of considered before. Like I previously just thought of it as kind of, you know, an independent contributor type thing, but thinking of it as like the SuperUMAN DAO earning consistent income off of this makes like a ton of sense.
Great, thanks.
Thanks for sharing. Did I read right, or did you say right, there was 40 to 50 of these requests that come across per day currently?
Yeah, approximately.
Yeah. Is that, do we expect a much larger number as those integrations grow? I'm just trying to get a sense of like anticipated volume there and where they're coming from.
Yeah. So Across is kind of a unique situation where, for like various reasons, Across basically only uses the optimistic oracle in cases of disputes. So
Yep.
the request volume is actually like much lower than you would think it is, although they're kind of using the infrastructure for everything. But yeah, like most of the volumes from specifically like the new Polymarket integration, I think for that, I would expect the volume to kind of stay relatively the same for a while, but hopefully like pick up even more. But then with new integrations coming online and other financial contracts, I think like the volume would just continue to increase if we believe that the number of integrations that like UMA secures also increases.
Cool. Which leads to my follow-up. Is the current financial incentive or reward, is that funded in UMA by kind of the overall economic model?
So it's not actually funded in UMA. Like price requesters themselves fund the reward, and like the price requester in the system is not paying any sort of tax to the overall system to use it. The price requester is simply paying that reward. So for most price requests that we get today, the reward is usually 50 USDC. So not in UMA, but actually USDC.
Yeah, cool. No, that's helpful. So Polymarket values the service enough for someone to put that resolution in by paying that from as the, kind of an expense.
Correct. And you also see that in like other financial contracts in the system. But yeah.
I had two questions. One, it's more of an analogy. This is sort of a decentralized mechanical Turk, but requiring binary questions. So is there a way to, I mean, sometimes mechanical Turk will say, is this photo a photo of a human being? Yes or no. So the question is from a market perspective, can you ask the same questions of mechanical Turk? If so, then that's probably a pretty good comparable in terms of what you can do with this and the size of the market. And my second is a separate question, which is this a racing game? So the first person to answer the question wins? Or like the mechanical Turk, can you look for any sort of multiple opinions?
I like that analogy a lot. It is like similar to mechanical Turk, right? Especially for this kind of type of price request. But, you know, price requests can get kind of arbitrarily complex. But yeah, that's a really good analogy for this. And it is a race. So the first proposer that responds, that is the proposal that's kind of judged and taken as kind of the accompanying proposal for the request. Thinking about it in terms of like a competition, if you're like looking at the competition as like a longer thing and not something that's just like kind of a one transaction type competition, you could also say that there's a competition for just quality of responses. If you have two proposers that are really competing in the system and one is like way faster and the other one is slower but more precise, the faster one will, you know, lose bonds over time and probably be incentivized to slow down their proposals. But within like single request proposal dispute process flows, it is a race, and the first proposal is what's taken.
Okay, appreciate it.
Who knew that degenning on quick results of things could be so profitable?
I mean, I think it creates a really cool system where you could think about like any betting platform in the world being owned completely by its users, right? So if I was already kind of betting on some sort of gambling website and I could go in and I could say like, this is what I think the outcome was, and potentially earn some sort of reward for just, like you said, watching a football game or like keeping track of a political election or whatever. And then other people could come in and see what the proposed resolution is for a certain amount of time and also disagree with that and make a reward off of that. I think that's a super powerful model and allows for kind of community ownership of some of these types of platforms that do require kind of human input for information.
You might have been alluding to this, but as you were saying that, this is itself can be a bit of a betting game in the following sense. You had one example where the answer was it cannot be determined yet, except for the fact that someone can forecast, right? So if you're at the end of, if you have 1 minute to go in the game and it's 49 not, well, you can go ahead and post the bond, claim that the win occurred. Someone can dispute it, but they can only dispute it after the fact has been made. So the first mover has an advantage if they have an ability to forecast accurately.
Yeah, that is interesting. And it'll be interesting to see how these things play out. In that specific scenario, I would argue, and I think the UMIP itself, so the canonical agreement of like how these requests should be handled, I think both of them would argue that within each price request, there's a certain timestamp, and that timestamp is what should be used to judge the answer to a specific question. So if somebody asked me at halftime what the outcome to this question is, I could answer, but if somebody disputed me, I would expect to lose that dispute. Now, things get into very gray areas like you're talking about, where somebody requests and proposes like 1 minute beforehand and a team is up by like 30 points and the answer is like pretty clear. It's much more likely that somebody doesn't come along and dispute me.
Well, the timestamps I imagine would have to be variable, right? Like you can't define what timestamp at the end of a game with game lengths being variable for some things, right?
Exactly.
Within some range of relative closeness, dispute would be really hard to, I guess, prove.
I do agree with that. And that is a problem kind of on the price request side as well as the price dispute side. Yeah, I completely agree. And like that is kind of an area that will be like interesting to see how it plays out when more people get involved in this, especially when it's very close and 30 seconds beforehand or a minute beforehand. Probably that proposal is taken as canon, which is okay, right? As long as it's correct.
I had a quick question. You said it's not public yet on the channel on the UMA. Do you know when it will be?
It should be later on today, in a few hours. Along with that, like I said, I will share my slides immediately after this call. The channel should be made public later on today, and I will ping in the general SuperUMAn channel the channel name when that does happen. And then the other thing would be documentation more closely detailing how the yes or no price identifier should be handled, as well as, you know, how the interface works and the logging channel works. That should be up, I hope, later on today, potentially tomorrow. And yeah, the other thing I would say is I don't really know how these things will be handled or if there's enough financial incentive at play where people do want to participate in these things. But like, if you do feel unclear and you do want to get involved, don't hesitate to reach out to me or any of the rest of the UMA team members before kind of making proposals or filing disputes or whatever, because that is financial